welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Elliot Waldman. Just a quick note before we get started that if you like what you hear on Trendlines, you can stay up to date with new episodes by hitting the subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts, if you haven't done so already. You can also find a full archive of previous episodes at worldpoliticsreview.com/podcast. A few weeks ago, after months of jockeying for influence, member states of the International Criminal Court held a secret ballot to determine the court's next chief prosecutor. The winner of the vote was Karim Khan, a British lawyer with extensive experience on both the prosecutorial and defense side of international criminal cases. Khan is set to take over from the current chief prosecutor at the ICC, Fatou Bensouda, in June, and he'll be only the third person to hold this role. Khan seems eminently well qualified for the job, but as the court wraps up its second decade in existence, it faces some pretty difficult questions about what kind of institution it will be in the years ahead. Joining me now to dig into this is Kyle Rapp. He's a PhD candidate specializing in international law at the University of Southern California and an adjunct professor at Pepperdine University. Kyle, welcome to Trendlines.
Thanks, I'm glad to be here.
It's great that you could join us. Before we dig into Karim Khan and his background, let's talk a little bit about the ICC itself and the role of the chief prosecutor. There seems to be a lot of confusion around these questions, especially about how the ICC is distinguished from the International Court of Justice, which is also in The Hague. So how is the ICC unique in the work it does, and what kinds of limitations does it have? Also, what kind of power does the chief prosecutor wield?
The ICC, unlike the ICJ, is focused on questions of international criminal law, which means it investigates individuals. So within a case, the focus is on what individuals may have done that constitutes genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, or the crime of aggression, whereas the ICJ focuses on states as sort of their own entities. So the ICC is really new in that it's the first permanent international criminal court. There were sort of ad hoc tribunals in the 90s for Yugoslavia and Rwanda, but the ICC sort of creates the first long-term permanent standing institution.
And so how has the role of chief prosecutor evolved over the course of the two people who have held that position so far?
So the chief prosecutor has a fair bit of discretion in what cases get investigated, what situations the court pays attention to. With the first prosecutor, Luis Morano Ocampo, there was a focus on, some might say, very big, sort of splashy indictments. So that would be when the court went after, say, Omar al-Bashir in Sudan, a sitting head of state, and very big, sort of explosive indictment by the court. But there weren't necessarily as many, the cases didn't go forward as far. Bensouda, the second prosecutor, has done a great job of really building on these cases, but has faced increasing pushback over time as the court settles in from different states. But there's been a move in particular to open investigations outside of the African continent. There's been a lot of accusation that the ICC is biased against Africa, with many of its early cases being located on the continent. And the move now opening investigations in Georgia, in the Palestinian territories, and in Afghanistan.
In terms of the process of selecting Khan, unlike the previous two chief prosecutors whom you mentioned, the parties to the ICC weren't able to reach consensus. So why was it so much more controversial this time?
Yeah, and that's a great question. I think it has a lot to do with where the court stands now and the questions of sort of where it's going to go moving ahead. The state parties weren't able to reach a consensus at the first instance, and then even when the list was expanded, which shows, there's a lot of, I think, disagreement among states who are party to the court about what they want the court to be doing, sort of the best direction they see for that. One thing that Khan is going to have his work really cut out for him here is the question of how the court navigates several of its newer cases, which are implicating very significant non-state party members or non-party members. So looking at the investigation in Afghanistan that raises questions about the jurisdiction over U.S. forces, or the investigation in Georgia that implicates Russia. So thinking how the court will be able to move ahead if it's encountering significant resistance from permanent members of the Security Council who also aren't members of the ICC.
And what are the major countries we should be aware of who are not party to the ICC that pose some limitations on the kind of work it does?
There's quite a few significant ones. As I noted, the US and Russia are both non-members who are currently implicated to various degrees in ICC investigations. More broadly, there's been discussions about trying to refer the situation in China with the Uyghur population to the ICC. China's not a member to the court. So that's another area where I'd expect a lot of pushback. Several other major members of the international community, for example, India, are not members of the court. And even if they're not directly involved in an investigation, it raises questions for the court about who supports it and who doesn't.
Is the court actually able to investigate in a meaningful way these cases that you're talking about that involve countries that are not party to the court?
Yeah, so it's important to note that even if a country isn't a party, if its citizens are involved in crimes that are listed in the Rome Statute, if they're involved in those on the territory of a state party, the court has jurisdiction there. So there's a common refrain in, for example, in some circles of U.S. foreign policy that the court doesn't have jurisdiction over U.S. service members. But in the case of Afghanistan, which is a party to the court, if those service members are implicated in an investigation, the court does, in a legal sense, have jurisdiction over them. It raises questions about the politics of the investigation, but the international law on the matter is quite clear. There's nothing prohibiting a state from sharing jurisdiction with the ICC.
This question of the jurisdiction over U.S. forces in Afghanistan was, I believe, something that led the Trump administration in its final months to impose sanctions on Fatou Bensouda, the current and outgoing prosecutor, right?
Yeah, and that was sort of a response to both the investigations in Afghanistan and the decision by the court to move ahead with investigations in the occupied Palestinian territories. Both of those triggered a pretty strong response from the Trump administration.
Now, in his candidate questionnaire, Khan was pretty blunt about the need for substantial changes at the ICC, specifically emphasizing that the court needs to really do better at putting victims and survivors of war crimes and crimes against humanity at the center of his work. What did he mean by that, and what kinds of shortcomings was he referring to exactly?
So the ICC has been criticized in many instances rightly in the past for being disconnected from the communities on the ground who are actually affected by the violence that they're investigating. I think Khan's calling attention to this and saying that it's not enough for the court to be sitting off in The Hague investigating these things in a very abstract and detached way. The court has important institutions for reaching out to communities. This is included in the past live broadcasting of court proceedings in community areas so that individuals who lived through this can go and see sort of justice playing out, and just different ways of showing folks in these areas, the court's investigating this. It's not just something that's way up like pie in the sky or that doesn't matter, finding ways to connect it to actual meaningful experiences for people, finding ways to, structure, if there's restitution that's paid, how is that invested to really help the community?
The desire to do that seems to provide some clues about what kind of prosecutor Khan will be. What else can we glean from his background to understand the approach he'll take to his new role?
I think one important thing to note is that he has significant experience on both sides of international criminal law. I think it's interesting to see a former defense council member now leading the prosecution. I think that's a good thing for the court. While it's of the utmost importance to protect sort of the needs and interests of victims, it's also important that the court reflects the rights of the accused. And I think having a former defense counsel there helps keep those in mind and shows that the court's really, it's not a case of, as sometimes international justice is accused, of victor's justice.
Are there going to be cases where he'll have to recuse himself for that reason?
I would expect that there would be. This is sort of an inevitable development of, it comes with him having such experience, is that there's going to be cases that might come up in, say, the appeals level where he has to recuse himself and someone else, and the court has a great staff. There's plenty of folks who will be able to take those on.
I know there have been quite a few controversial cases Khan has been involved with in the past, one of his more notable clients being William Ruto of Kenya. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that and what that says about what kind of chief prosecutor Khan might be.
Yeah, so the Ruto case followed on post-election violence in Kenya in 2007. It was a case that featured quite heavily in Khan's nomination and election process. Civil society groups from Kenya raised concerns about how about violence. There's a death of a defense witness and accusations that Khan did not do enough to really call for an investigation into that. Khan issued his own defense during the process, saying that he had been in communication with the Kenyan government, urging for a full investigation, and that the other organizations within the ICC that focused on victims and witnesses were more in a position to deal with that than he was. So sort of sidestepping the question there. But it does raise questions. The trial ended without any sort of guilty verdict. So, in one sense, Khan did his job as a defense lawyer, but then there's questions of him appearing at political rallies in Kenya during this time, which might raise questions about impartiality. At the same time, it doesn't seem like there's any indication that he did anything uncouth. I think he was doing right by his clients, who, everyone deserves a fair trial and the best representation they can get. But it's definitely going to be a case that's not going to necessarily win him much support or many fans in the NGO community. And it does raise questions about sort of his willingness to protect witnesses and his relationship between state members who are accused and sort of the court itself.
But to be clear, he wasn't accused of any formal wrongdoing over that case.
No, he was not. And I think I don't think there's anything to indicate that he should have been or that anything there was untoward.
Are there any other controversial cases that might add to these dark clouds as he prepares to take office?
Not that I can think of that directly would implicate him, but I think there's going to be a lot of attention paid to, in particular, the investigation in Palestine, and depending how that goes, could really raise concerns and sort of amplify concerns that are already there about how the court treats, in particular, more powerful states. There's been criticism levied against the court in the past that it goes after weaker states that are perhaps less capable of really pushing back in the international stage. Even within those states, investigations have often focused on non-state groups. With the Palestine investigation, Israel may be subject to investigation about its settlement policies, about its occupation policies. And as we mentioned earlier, this has raised pushback from the US. And if the court is seen to be sort of deferring to these pressures in a way that's not motivated by questions of justice and the law, but by questions of power politics, that could really harm the court going forward.
What are the risks on the other side if the court pushes ahead aggressively with investigating these accusations in Palestine?
So I think one thing to note is that while the Trump administration brought forward sanctions, the Biden administration has not rolled those back yet. So, I think there's a very good reasons that many folks in the international justice community more broadly expect the Biden administration to cooperate more with the court. This fact that these sanctions are being left in place and that the decision whether to remove them or not is not the thing that the administration is moving the quickest on might raise some concerns. So Khan and the ICC more broadly moving ahead are probably cognizant of this fact that the US, while willing to cooperate in some areas, might still put up quite a fight here. There's also then the issue that many of the court's more traditional supporters have raised questions about the decision to continue with the Palestine investigation. For example, the German Foreign Ministry issued a statement where they questioned this, sort of more broadly questioning Palestine's standing as a state party. So the court not only might face pressure from the US, but might face some hesitance or skepticism from quarters where it traditionally gained support. And if all of these groups are sort of pushing against it, that's really going to, create a tense environment for the court to operate in.
So it'll be a tough balancing act, in other words, for Khan to pull off.
Yeah, on the one hand, there's the questions of justice and civil society, as well as many ICC member states who have felt that the court's been very biased in who it investigates and the need to address those. But on the other side, there's very real questions of power and politics and how much will the Biden administration cooperate with the court versus how much hostility might they still face.
Have we seen any indications from the Biden administration on the other question we talked about earlier about investigating U.S. soldiers accused of committing war crimes in Afghanistan?
Not that I am familiar with, but I would expect that the Biden administration's response would be similar in meaning, if not tone, to the Trump administration's response.
A more polite refusal, in other words.
Exactly. The U.S. has been pretty consistent in that it does not want to see the court's jurisdiction applied to U.S. service members, and that's been broadly across administrations.
You mentioned earlier this focus that the ICC had on African countries in its early years and the pushback that it got for that. Bensouda, the outgoing prosecutor, had widened the court's geographic scope pretty substantially. Maybe you could talk a little bit about whether Khan is expected to continue doing that, whether we can expect him to open new cases that might sort of raise new frontiers for the court.
Yeah, and that's a great question. So Fatou Bensouda did a great job of, like you said, broadening the court's scope. One thing that I think is important to note with many of these early cases is that there were several self-referrals, which are where ICC member states invite the court to investigate a situation that's ongoing within their borders. So it's not that the court right at the start went out seeking these cases. In many situations, they were brought in by the state. But Fatou Bensouda did a really important job of showing that the court's not just investigating situations in Africa. With that said, I think Khan's going to have a very tricky sort of job moving ahead between the desire to open more cases and the reality that the court is limited by its resources. In many cases, if you're opening new investigations, that's spreading yourself thinner and thinner if you already have situations that are ongoing and where you need to be focusing your attention. There were discussions when the Sudan case sort of got really brought back to the forefront that the court had, set it aside for a bit. And there was a scramble there to find where are the resources that we can put back into this investigation. So while Khan might want to open new cases or sort of expand the court, there's going to be a balancing act between which cases are, possibly being wrapped up, or are the state parties willing to put forward more support to help the court do that?
Let's talk a little bit more about ongoing cases that might be interesting to dig into. I know, for instance, there's one in Myanmar concerning the treatment of the Rohingya ethnic minority. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, and so that's going to be a very important case moving ahead as well. One tricky thing with the Myanmar case is that Myanmar is not a state party. So the court has found that it has jurisdiction on the basis that communities were displaced and fled into Bangladesh, which is a member of the ICC. So it's a case that raises some interesting jurisdictional questions that the court has largely interpreted sort of in a positive way for questions of justice. It's going to be an uphill investigation. There's always a challenge to, in this case, where the crimes were committed, where the bulk of the evidence will be. We wouldn't expect Myanmar to cooperate much with ICC investigators hoping to get to those areas. So while the court can interview folks who have been displaced, it might be tricky to really build that case together without having access to Myanmar itself. And I don't think, especially following the recent coup, that we're going to see much willingness from the government there to let investigators in.
What are some other cases that you're watching in particular, keeping an eye on?
One that has been moving along perhaps a bit more smoothly than the court might have expected is an investigation in Mali. The court in, I believe it was 2019, had its first guilty plea in that case. And it's implicating questions of protection of cultural heritage, among other things. And it's a case where many members of the international community have cooperated with the court moving ahead with this. This was an instance where the U.S. actually surrendered an individual to it who wound up in U.S. custody. So sort of showing that, it's not all, I guess, hardships and challenges for the court, that some of these cases can sort of move ahead and that there's broad international support, even if they're perhaps not the really big name cases that are popping up on the attention of, say, like the U.S. or Russia.
Speaking of Russia, you did mention also there's a case in Georgia involving Moscow. How is that going?
It's going as questions of international justice tend to, slowly. It's another situation where, as we discussed, Russia is not a member to the ICC. And this is a question also involving self-proclaimed breakaway republics in Georgia. There's a lot of contestation there, so the court's moving ahead with it, but it's not a case where, personally, I would expect to see major breakthroughs anytime soon.
Kyle, thanks so much for making the time for this discussion today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was great to be here.
Kyle Rapp is a PhD candidate specializing in international law at the University of Southern California and an adjunct professor at Pepperdine University. If you'd like to comment on the discussion, ask a question, or even suggest a topic for a future episode, drop us a line at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. This episode of Trendlines was produced by me, Elliot Waldman, and edited by Peter Dury. You can follow the team on Twitter if you'd like. WPR's handle is @WPReview. I'm at Elliot Waldman with 2 L's and 1 T. And Peter is at PETERDOERRIE. Thanks for listening, and tune in again next week.